When two white cops framed a black woman on a dark Virginia road, they had no idea who she really was. But when the truth hit the courtroom, it didn't just clear her name, it burned the whole system down. The rain had just started to fall when Talia Porter turned onto Jefferson Avenue, the dim streetlights painting streaks of gold across her windshield. It was almost midnight in Richmond, Virginia, and the city had that eerie stillness that only came when everyone sensible was already asleep. But Talia wasn't everyone. She'd just left a secure facility an hour outside the city, a place that didn't officially exist, where her latest CIA debrief had run late. Her phone buzzed once, an encrypted text. Debrief confirmed. Lay low, we'll contact you Monday. She exhaled, tossing the phone on the passenger seat. Lay low, she muttered. Right. That phrase always made her laugh. A black woman in America, driving alone at night. Laying low wasn't exactly an option. She signaled to turn left at the stop sign and came to a full stop. No cars, no noise. Then, red and blue lights flared behind her. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she glanced in the mirror. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser. White, late 30s, built like they lived at the gym. One had the easy swagger of a man who thought the badge made him untouchable. Come on, Talia, she whispered to herself, forcing a breath to stay calm. She rolled down her window just as the first officer approached. Evening, ma'am. His tone carried the kind of politeness that sounded practiced, not real. License and registration. Of course, officer. She handed them over. Steady hands, calm voice. The second cop circled her car with a flashlight. You rolled that stop sign back there, he said. No, sir. I stopped fully. I checked both sides. The first one, Carter, she noticed from his badge, smiled. You sure about that? Her instinct screamed that something's off. She'd seen that smile before, overseas, in interrogation rooms, on men who liked power too much. Yes, I'm sure. Well, Carter said, glancing at his partner. Let's make sure everything else checks out. Mind if we take a quick look in your trunk? Talia hesitated. Is there a reason for that? He leaned in, his breath sour with coffee and arrogance. Reason? Ma'am, you got nothing to hide, right? Her CIA training kicked in. Assess, comply, document. She hit the record button on her phone hidden under her thigh. Sure, she said evenly. Go ahead. The trunk popped open. Sullivan, the other officer, rummaged inside. 10 seconds later, he shouted, Carter, look at this! Talia turned, and her stomach sunk. In his gloved hands, Sullivan held a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Carter grinned. Well, well, looks like we got ourselves a party favor. That's not mine, Talia said instantly. Of course not, Carter replied, voice dripping with sarcasm. You mind stepping out of the vehicle? As she opened the door, the rain intensified, fat, heavy drops pelting the pavement. She stood under the flashing lights, feeling them blur in her vision like a bad dream. Carter pulled her hands behind her back, the cold metal cuffs snapping shut around her wrists. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, he said. Officer, I think you're making a mistake. He smirked. We'll let the evidence decide. Talia didn't fight, didn't argue. She just met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Somewhere deep in her mind, the agent in her was already taking notes. Tone of voice, placement of evidence, sequence of movement. Everything would matter later. When they shoved her into the back of the cruiser, she looked out the rain-soaked window. The city lights blurred into streaks of blue and red. She whispered to herself, You picked the wrong woman tonight. And for the first time since the lights appeared, a small, defiant smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Because Talia Porter wasn't just another woman pulled over on a lonely road. She was a CIA field operative, and these two officers had no idea what kind of storm they'd just walked into. The squad car smelled like stale coffee and sweat. Rain pattered on the roof as they drove through the quiet Virginia streets, the sirens long silenced. Carter and Sullivan talked like she wasn't even there. Another one for the books, Carter said, glancing back at her through the cage barrier. You'd think people would stop trying to run that stuff through our city. Sullivan laughed. Yeah, well, they never learned. This'll look good on the monthly report. Talia said nothing. Her wrists ached against the cuffs, but she kept her eyes steady on the back of their heads, memorizing every word. Her mind split into two channels, the fear and anger on one side, the trained analyst on the other. That side cataloged details, the route they took, the timestamp on the dash cam, the way Sullivan avoided looking into the rearview mirror. When they pulled into the precinct lot, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Carter yanked open her door. "Watch your step, ma'am. Wouldn't want you to slip and hurt yourself before we book you." She stepped out slowly, the wet pavement reflecting the police lights and broken ribbons. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked softly. "Through with what?" "Planting evidence, falsifying a report, the usual things men like you get away with." His jaw clenched. "Lady, you might want to keep that attitude in check. I'm just saying, you should probably be more careful about where you look next time you check a trunk." Carter blinked, just for a second, and she caught it. That micro expression of doubt. Good. She'd planted her first seed. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they booked her in. Sullivan filled out the paperwork while Carter inventoried her possessions, his tone professional, his smirk anything but. "Name?" Sullivan asked. "Talia Porter." "Occupation?" "Consultant," she replied, her default cover. "What kind of consultant?" "The kind that helps people uncover things they shouldn't have hidden." He looked up at her, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," she said, smiling. They took her fingerprints, her mugshot, her phone, everything by the book, on the surface. But Talia noticed the little things, the body cam Carter forgot to turn on, the missing timestamp on the evidence bag. She filed every detail away like pieces of a puzzle. When they finally locked her in a holding cell, she sat down on the cold bench, dripping water onto the concrete floor. Across the hall, a younger officer, couldn't have been more than 26, glanced her way. His nameplate read Keller. His eyes didn't have that dead, cynical look the others wore. Talia met his gaze, steady and deliberate. "You ever wonder if the wrong people end up behind bars?" she asked quietly. "Excuse me?" "Nothing," she said, leaning back against the wall. Carter walked by at that moment, slapping Keller on the shoulder. "Don't bother chatting with the junkies, rookie. They'll twist your head around." Keller forced a half smile and turned away, but not before glancing back at Talia one more time. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Another seed planted. As the cell door clanged shut and the officer's laughter faded down the corridor, Talia leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. This wasn't a random arrest. This was a pattern, and she'd just been dropped inside it. But unlike the others, she had the means to blow it apart from the inside. And when she did, she'd make sure Carter and Sullivan never wore a badge again.
Morning crept slowly into the Richmond precinct, gray, damp, and quiet, except for the hum of vending machines and the occasional buzz of a radio call. Talia hadn't slept. The bench in her cell was unforgiving, and the flickering fluorescent light above made it impossible to rest. She'd spent the night running through every move Carter and Sullivan made, every inconsistency, every weak link. And that weak link had a name: Keller. She could sense the unease in him last night, the way he hesitated before turning away, the flicker of doubt that hadn't left his face. Most rookies either mimicked their superiors or stayed silent, afraid to challenge authority. But Keller looked like someone still deciding which kind of man he wanted to be. At 7:13 a.m., the steel door buzzed open. Keller appeared, holding a clipboard. "You've got a hearing this afternoon," he said quietly, avoiding direct eye contact. "They'll process you in an hour." Talia studied him. His uniform was crisp, his posture a little too rigid, like someone trying to prove they belonged. "Officer Keller," she said calmly, "how long have you worked here?" He blinked. 6 months. "That explains it." He frowned. "Explains what?" "That you still look like you have a conscience." Keller stiffened. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job." "Sure you are. But you've read the report on me, right? You saw how perfectly written it was, the kind of perfection that doesn't happen when things are real." He hesitated again, but before he could answer, Carter's booming voice echoed down the hall. "Keller, you babysitting the suspect or asking for her autograph?" The rookie stepped back, mumbling, "Just confirming transfer details." Carter chuckled, swaggering closer. He tossed a cup of coffee on the booking desk, the smell thick and bitter. "Don't waste your time, she's already cooked. Open and shut case." Talia met Carter's smug grin through the bars. "You really think that?" "I don't think, sweetheart. I know." He leaned in. "Enjoy your bail hearing. Hope you got friends who can pay for good lawyers." She gave him a thin smile. "Oh, I've got friends. You'll meet them soon enough." For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Confusion, maybe even fear, but it vanished under his cocky grin. He walked away, laughing with Sullivan, leaving the faint smell of burnt coffee. Keller lingered a moment longer before following, and as he turned the corner, Talia noticed something. He glanced over his shoulder, as if he couldn't quite shake her words. Perfect. She leaned back, closing her eyes again, letting the silence settle. Then she shifted slightly, pressing her thumb against a small, barely visible bump on the inside of her shirt cuff. The micro device embedded in her shirt vibrated once, faint like a heartbeat. A signal. Somewhere, several miles away, in a secure CIA operations van parked near the outskirts of the city, a technician's screen lit up. Signal acquired. Agent Porter, active distress beacon confirmed. Talia didn't smile this time. She didn't have to. Help was coming, but she wasn't planning to wait around like a victim. She had work to do, because if she could push Keller far enough, if she could make him question the story his superiors were feeding him, she could turn him into exactly what she needed: an insider.
The rain had stopped by noon, but inside the Richmond precinct, tension hung thick in the air. Keller sat at his desk, scrolling through Carter's incident report. Every detail looked too perfect. The kind of perfection you only saw in training manuals, not real police work. The timestamps aligned flawlessly, the evidence tag numbers were sequential, the written statement read like a copy-paste template. Something inside him itched. He'd spent the morning replaying Talia's words. "You still look like you have a conscience." He wanted to shrug them off, but the tone in her voice had lodged itself deep, like a splinter he couldn't ignore. Carter walked past, slapping him on the back. "Still reading that report, rookie? Relax. That one's as clean as it gets. Open and shut." "Yeah," Keller said, forcing a nod. "Just learning the ropes." "Good man. We could use more guys who follow orders." Then he winked. "And fewer who ask questions." When he left, Keller exhaled and turned back to the computer. He opened another file, a case from 2 months earlier. A traffic stop, same officers, same pattern. Suspect nervous, probable cause to search, controlled substance recovered. The suspect's name, Marcus Dean, 28, African American. Charges dropped later due to procedural error. Keller's stomach turned. He pulled up 3 more reports, all similar, all by Carter and Sullivan. Different names, same wording. It was like they were recycling a template to frame people. He grabbed the flash drive from his locker and copied the files. His hand trembled slightly as he slid it into his jacket pocket. Meanwhile,
Several miles away, a black van sat parked in an alley behind a bakery. Inside, 2 agents monitored screens filled with data. "Agent Porter's beacon is active," one said. "Location confirmed. Richmond PD precinct." "Audio?" the other asked. "Intermittent, picking up fragments of conversation. Names? Carter, Sullivan, Keller." The senior agent leaned closer to the screen. "Keller? That's new. Keep him flagged. She might have found a friendly." Back inside the precinct, Keller walked down the hall, clutching a stack of reports. He passed Carter and Sullivan laughing near the coffee machine, bragging about teaching people a lesson. Their voices echoed down the corridor, arrogant, careless. He slipped into the evidence room, closing the door quietly behind him. The air smelled like cardboard and bleach. His heart pounded as he flipped through the evidence logs. There it was. Bag number 2741. Seizure date, March 14th, Officer Carter. But the corresponding tag number on the physical bag in the locker read number 2743. Mismatched. Altered. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. A soft knock startled him. Keller spun around. It was Talia, escorted by another officer for her bail processing. Their eyes met for a half second. She didn't speak, but the smallest nod passed between them as if she knew exactly what he'd found. The officer barked, "Keep moving!" She did, calm, silent. Her expression unreadable, but Keller caught the faintest smirk as she disappeared around the corner. Back at his desk, he opened a blank email, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew what he was about to do could end his career, maybe even worse. But he couldn't shake the feeling that if he stayed silent, he'd be part of something rotten. He started typing. Anonymous tip, Internal Affairs/FBI Division. Pattern of falsified evidence at Richmond PD. Officers involved, Brandon Carter, Mark Sullivan. He attached the files, hit send, and closed his laptop with a shaky breath. Outside, thunder rolled again, faint but growing. And in a van across town, a CIA analyst smiled as a new notification appeared on screen. Incoming data, forwarded from unknown local source. Encryption match. FBI protocols. Agent Porter's plan was working. The first crack in the system had just opened.
By the next morning, the whole precinct felt off. Keller could sense it in the way Carter barked orders louder than usual, the way Sullivan hovered around the evidence room like a dog guarding a bone. Something was shifting. They could feel it too. The anonymous email had been sent 12 hours earlier, but Keller couldn't shake the paranoia that someone might trace it back to him. He'd used a burner account, routed through multiple proxies, but fear doesn't listen to logic. It just hums in the back of your mind, constant, relentless. He sat at his desk pretending to fill out a report when Carter slammed a newspaper down beside him. "Guess who's making headlines again?" Carter said, grinning. "Our little drug runner's got herself a bail hearing today, probably thinking she can walk out like nothing happened." Keller forced a chuckle, but his stomach churned. "You going to the hearing?" "Nah, George will handle it. We did our job." Carter leaned closer. "And don't worry, rookie. Whatever noise you've been hearing about internal reviews, it's routine. Happens every few months." Keller froze. Internal reviews. So the higher-ups already knew something. I was fast. Too fast. He nodded slowly, trying to look calm. "Sure thing, Sarge." Carter grinned, slapped him on the shoulder, and walked away. Sullivan followed, muttering something about tightening up the paperwork. As soon as they were gone, Keller opened his email again. No reply. No acknowledgement from Internal Affairs or the FBI. Just silence. He didn't know that somewhere deep within a federal server, his message had been rerouted, intercepted by a quiet subnetwork within the CIA's Field Intelligence Unit. In a van parked across from the courthouse, 2 agents watched a live feed of the hearing. One of them adjusted his earpiece. "Porter's inside. She just signaled, pulse speaking steady. The rookie's playing his part." The other agent smirked. Poor kid probably doesn't even know he's in a federal operation now. In the courthouse, Talia sat handcuffed at the defendant's table, wearing the same calm, unreadable expression she'd worn the night she was arrested. The public defender beside her flipped through a thin folder of paperwork, too thin in her opinion for a case this serious. Miss Porter will try to get you released on bond, but the evidence is fabricated, and you'll see proof of that soon. The attorney blinked, unsure what to make of her confidence. When the judge called her name, Talia stood, hands clasped. Carter and Sullivan weren't there, only a substitute officer representing their team. The judge reviewed the file, frowned at inconsistencies in the report, and sighed. Bail granted, pending further investigation. The gavel hit the block. As the cuffs came off, Talia allowed herself a small breath. She didn't smile, not yet. She just glanced up at the ceiling corner, where she knew a hidden CIA camera lens was watching. One subtle tap on her bracelet sent a brief signal. Message received, she's out. That night, Keller couldn't sleep. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by open folders, copies of reports, timestamps, arrest photos. Every one of them told the same story. Men who looked like Carter, smiling after big busts, and men who looked like Marcus Dean or Talia Porter, staring blankly into the camera, framed, broken, silent. He grabbed his phone and typed a message into a note app. If they find out, I'm done. But if I don't do anything, I'm no better than them. He deleted it right after. Then, just past midnight, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A calm, firm voice spoke. Officer Keller, don't panic. This is Special Agent Price, FBI CIA Task Division. We received your data. Keller's throat dried. You got my email? Yes, and it was the right thing to do, but now you're in danger. They know someone is watching them. We'll protect you, but we need more. Keller swallowed hard. What do you need? Proof they've done this before. Real evidence, video, audio, something they can't bury. Can you get that? He hesitated, and looked around his tiny apartment, the peeling paint, the flickering light, and the loneliness of choosing silence too long. Yeah, he said finally. I'll get it. Good, because tomorrow, everything starts moving fast. The call ended. Keller sat in the dark, staring at his reflection in the window. Rain had started again, tapping softly against the glass, like the sound of a countdown. He didn't know it yet, but by sunrise, the FBI and CIA would be moving in tandem, and the two men who thought they were untouchable were about to realize they weren't the hunters anymore.
The morning came like a whisper before a storm, the kind of calm that feels wrong. Inside the Richmond precinct, the coffee pot hissed, the phones rang, and life looked normal. But underneath, everything was seconds from cracking open. Carter was in the break room, laughing with Sullivan over some half-baked joke, when the door burst open. A team of men and women in dark suits swept in, badges flashing, voices firm. "Federal agents, nobody moves." The laughter died instantly. The sound of boots on tile filled the air as FBI and CIA officers fanned through the building, securing every exit. Keller froze at his desk, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected it to happen this soon. Carter stood, face twisted in confusion. What the hell is this? A tall, calm man stepped forward, Special Agent Price. His voice was sharp, authoritative. "Brandon Carter, Mark Sullivan, you're under investigation for falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations." Carter scoffed. "You've got the wrong guys." Price didn't blink. "We've got your cases, your reports, your missing evidence tags, and your body cam footage." That last word hit like a bullet. Sullivan turned pale. Keller watched from his desk as Price pulled out a small tablet and played a video. The footage showed Carter opening Talia's trunk, his body cam accidentally on. The timestamp matched the arrest report, but in the corner of the frame, the small bag of powder was already visible in his hand before the search began. Carter's face drained of color. That's taken out of context. Price stepped closer. The context is a planted bag and a woman framed for a felony. The context is you laughing about it on a recorded line. Sullivan stammered, "You can't prove..." But Price cut him off. "Actually, we can. And your partner here," he nodded toward Keller, "just helped us do it." Every head turned. Keller froze under Carter's glare, a mix of betrayal and rage. "You?" Carter growled, stepping forward. "You little rat!" 2 FBI agents intercepted him, forcing him back to his seat. Price motioned to another officer, "Bring her in." The room fell silent as the door opened and Talia Porter walked in. No cuffs this time, no fear, just quiet, controlled authority. She wore a simple dark blazer and a look that made even the hardened detectives step aside. Carter's jaw dropped. "What the hell?" "CIA," Price said evenly. "Undercover operative." Talia crossed her arms. "You boys really should have read the manual on profiling. I almost felt insulted." Sullivan muttered something under his breath. Carter stayed silent, seething. Talia turned to Keller and gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "You did good." Then she faced the 2 corrupt officers. "You thought you could play God with people's lives, frame them, break them, move on like nothing happened. But you forgot one thing. Someone always watches." Price leaned forward and pressed a file onto the table. "We've cross-referenced your arrests for the last 2 years. 23 cases, all with identical patterns, mostly targeting Black or Hispanic citizens. Half were dropped, the rest pled out to avoid jail. You 2 made careers out of destroying lives." The agents cuffed Carter and Sullivan. The sound of metal snapping shut echoed through the room. As they were led out, Carter turned his head toward Talia. "You think you're saving the world? You're just another suit cleaning up a mess that never ends." She looked him in the eye, calm and unflinching. "Maybe, but at least I'm cleaning, not spreading it." He sneered, but the agents pushed him forward, down the hall where cameras from the waiting media outside flashed like lightning. When the door closed, Price let out a quiet breath. Hell of a case. Talia smiled faintly. Hell of a rookie. Keller blinked, unsure whether to speak. I didn't know who you were." "You weren't supposed to," she said. "You just had to do the right thing." He looked down, exhaling. "Feels like that's rarer than it should be." Talia nodded. "That's why it matters when someone does it." Price stepped forward, shaking Keller's hand. "You just exposed a corruption network that could have gone on for years. You did the hard part. You believed what you saw." For the first time in weeks, Keller smiled. It was small, but real. And for Talia, watching the agents escort Carter and Sullivan into waiting federal cars, it wasn't triumph she felt. It was release. The storm she'd been trapped in had finally broken. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Corruption didn't die in one precinct or one case. It only retreated until someone else brave enough stood up again.
By the next sunrise, Richmond wasn't the same city. News vans crowded the precinct parking lot, their satellite dishes cutting against the cloudy morning sky. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions that bounced through the air like gunfire. 2 Richmond officers under federal arrest for corruption and evidence tampering. Were they targeting minorities? How deep does the cover-up go? Every headline screamed betrayal. Justice framed, the badge betrayed. 2 cops, 1 lie. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Officers whispered in corners, some angry, some ashamed, others scared to even make eye contact. The chief had been suspended pending investigation. Internal Affairs was combing through every file Carter and Sullivan had ever touched, and the FBI had turned an entire conference room into a war room of case folders and evidence boards. Keller sat in that room, hunched over a table,
reviewing transcripts. His badge was still on his chest, but it felt heavier now. He wasn't sure if he could keep wearing it. Across from him, Special Agent Price flipped through a folder. "You did good work, Keller, but I won't lie to you. This kind of rot doesn't stop at 2 names. You ready for that?" He hesitated. "I didn't join to bury people. I joined to protect them. I guess now I actually get to do that." Price nodded, satisfied. "Then maybe this isn't the end for you. Maybe it's the beginning." Later that afternoon, Talia met Keller at a quiet diner off Broad Street, neutral ground, away from the cameras and the chaos. The smell of coffee and old vinyl hung in the air. She slid into the booth across from him. "You look like you haven't slept." He gave a tired laugh. "You're one to talk. Heard you've been busy with the press." "They don't know the half of it, and they won't. The CIA is keeping my cover story simple. Federal witness. Easier that way." Keller stirred his coffee. "What happens now? To the people those guys framed?" Talia's eyes softened. "We're reopening every case. Some of those victims are already being cleared. Families are finally getting answers." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I keep thinking about how many times I stood next to those two. Never noticed anything, never questioned anything. Because you trusted the system," Talia said. "That's not weakness, that's what they exploited." He looked at her, frustration mixed with guilt. "So what, I just forgive myself and move on?" "No," she said quietly. "You use it. Every time you see something wrong, every time someone tries to hide the truth, remember this feeling, and then act." For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, a bus rumbled past, carrying a poster on its side with the words, "Justice Reform Now." The world was paying attention. Talia reached into her jacket and placed a small black business card on the table. It had no phone number, just a symbol, a simple silver triangle, the CIA Field Division mark. "If you ever decide you're done being a cop, call the number on the back. The world could use more people who've seen both sides." He turned the card over, a single number etched in silver ink. "You're serious?" "I don't joke much." They sat in silence, the weight of what they'd both endured settling between them. Then Keller said softly, "You think this really changes anything? The system, I mean?" Talia looked out the window at the reporters, the flashing cameras, the city stirring with uncomfortable truth. "Maybe not overnight, but this is how it starts." A pause. Then, for the first time, she allowed herself a genuine smile. That evening, a local news anchor spoke over footage of Carter and Sullivan being transferred to federal custody. The Richmond Police Department has confirmed an internal investigation into over 25 cases linked to the 2 disgraced officers. Civil rights advocates are calling this a watershed moment in the fight against systemic corruption. In the background of that footage, Talia could be seen briefly exiting the courthouse beside Agent Price. She didn't stop for the cameras. She didn't need to. Her work wasn't about recognition. Keller watched the broadcast from his apartment, badge still sitting on his kitchen counter. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and for the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he'd never look away again.
1 year later, Richmond looked different. The city still bore its scars, but it had started to heal. The precinct where Carter and Sullivan once ruled the night now had new leadership, diverse, transparent, and relentless about reform. A plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to those who stood for the truth when silence was easier." Inside that same building, Officer James Keller, now Detective Keller, led a small task force investigating evidence tampering and racial bias complaints statewide. The office buzzed with new energy. Younger officers looked up to him, seeing not a whistleblower,
but a man who refused to bend. On his desk sat a small black triangle card, faded from handling, the CIA's symbol barely visible now. He'd kept it close, though he'd never called the number. That morning, he opened his laptop and reviewed a file from Norfolk, an eerily familiar case. Young black driver, probable cause, suspicious behavior. But this time, something was different. The arresting officer had included full dashcam footage, witness statements, and even body cam transcripts. Transparency, the kind that Keller had fought for. He smiled faintly, closing the file. Maybe the change had started, after all. Meanwhile, somewhere in Langley, Virginia, Talia Porter walked briskly through the CIA headquarters. Her hair was shorter now, her stride more confident than ever. She passed by the operations division, nodded to a few analysts, and entered a secure conference room. Inside sat a dozen new recruits, young, eager, full of idealism. "Welcome to Covert Operations Training," she began, setting a thick file on the table. "Before we start, I want you to remember one thing. Truth is the most dangerous weapon you'll ever carry, but it's also the one thing that can't be faked." She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. "You'll be tempted to take shortcuts. You'll meet people who use power as a shield. When that happens, ask yourself who you really serve." Her voice softened just slightly. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from the people who refuse to let it rot. After the session, as the recruits filed out, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. "Porter," she said. "Hey," Keller's voice came through, calm but warm. "Just wanted to say, that thing you started here, it's spreading. Whole precincts are changing policy. You did that." She chuckled. "We did that. Ever think of calling that number I gave you?" He hesitated. "Not yet. The world still needs honest cops." "Then keep being one. I'll handle the shadows, you handle the light." He smiled on the other end. "Deal." The line went quiet, but it wasn't the silence of distance. It was respect. Mutual understanding between two people who had walked through hell and come out on the other side. That night, the city skyline shimmered beneath the rising moon. Streetlights flickered and distant sirens hummed, not of chaos, but of life moving on. Talia stood by her apartment window, sipping tea, watching the glow of Richmond in the distance. She thought of every face, the victims, the lies, the courage it took to stand up. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope wasn't naive, it was necessary. She set her cup down, opened her laptop, and began typing a new report. The subject line read, "Operation Integrity, Phase 2." Because truth didn't end in court, it lived in every action, every choice, every person who refused to look away. And as the clock ticked past midnight, one thing became clear. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed that justice, no matter late, was still worth chasing.